Welcome to the world building session. Today I'm going to be talking about designing creatures again. I'm going to be focusing on some here at the end of this book that are for an Arctic/tundra region, but I'll also be going back and featuring some from other sessions or even from drawings that I did outside of sessions. I think it's key to note right off the bat that when I'm talking about designing creatures, there's two very different but fairly basic angles that I approach it from. One is designing animals and creatures based on our reality, and the other is designing them from absolute scratch. I think that the first of these is generally the best place to start, because if you have a good understanding of why our world presents creatures the way that it does, it's going to make it easier to create fantastic and surrealistic ones in other environments. If you look at Star Wars, that's a really good example of basically every creature in there is just something that is fantastic. Sometimes they're built to fill niches that you would see in our world, and sometimes they're not. Sometimes they're totally fantastic. I generally enjoy the other side of it more. I like taking things and exaggerating them and moving them and playing with their features. And to that end, I have 4 different strategies that I'm going to talk about today that I use for myself when I'm world building these. I don't know that I'll have examples of all of them, but I'll talk about all of them, and maybe we'll get into some kind of interesting things there. So if you've been enjoying these sessions, I would encourage you to like and to subscribe if you're not already. It does help. I don't often ask for those kind of things because I'm just not a big fan of it, but it does help. It brings other people here, and if you're enjoying what you're seeing, there's a good chance that someone else might as well. So the first of these steps, in fact, I'm just going to go through all 4 of these steps at the beginning and then close in. So the first is to change the size of a creature. The second is to change the environment of a creature. The third is to change a core feature. And the fourth is to exaggerate a physical feature. So let's go ahead and start with that first one, to change the size of a thing. I think this is honestly the easiest way to start world building your animals and creatures. If you just take an Earth world or an Earth adjacent world, we understand how all the animals work here, or at least we think we understand how all the animals work here. And if you start really playing around with the basics of things, how they function, and exaggerate some of the sizes, either up or down, you're going to get some really interesting results. And this might be as simple as something like this, which I envisioned in one of the last sessions as being basically a small hippopotamus animal that lives in this particular environment in the tundra. And this one as well kind of fits that. It's a pika, which are generally very, very small, and this one is gigantic, and it's filling out a role there as well. And if I jump back here, I've actually got some from a session several times back, where we've got a giant nautilus, we've got a Portuguese man-of-war that's so large that it's floating. Just making things way bigger becomes a lot of fun. Exaggerating the size of a creature is just a really easy way to make it seem unique and different. And you don't really have to change a whole lot beyond that. You can, obviously. And the thing is, there's no reason why you can't take many of these strategies and employ all of them or employ multiple ones in the same creature. But I find that it's generally a good place to start. So if you are looking at your world and you're just not sure what to begin with, I would find animals that you enjoy, that you find rather unique, and I would play with them and figure out how you can change individual aspects that make them just a little bit more interesting. And size is definitely the best place to start. In most fantasy worlds, there's generally giants of some kind. Sometimes these are very literal giants, and sometimes they're just giant creatures. If I think about Lord of the Rings, for example, you've got the Mumakil, which are these gigantic elephant-like creatures. And they pretty much are in the lore, and I think in Peter Jackson's movie as well. They're basically just giant elephants. Like, there's not really anything crazy about them. They've got maybe longer tusks than they would otherwise, but it's hard to say how something that exaggerated would look in comparison to its natural born kin. But that is a really simple strategy. You can make things so much more interesting just by upsizing them. A lot of monster movies get away with this with gigantic spiders and scorpions and things like that. I'm doing it in my story with giant crabs and beetles and whales, and basically I'm just trying to take all the stuff that we naturally have here and then make versions of it that are incredibly big and in versions that are incredibly small. I find the small is sometimes really endearing. You can create some really beautiful, funny things that way. But this one over here is also another kind of supersized critter. You probably can't see too much yet, but I'll start working on it here. And it's a snail. And again, snails in our world are not something that are very large. Obviously some can be, as big as your hand or as big as your head. We ran into some in Hawaii last year that were really, really big by like natural standards. And I think that's kind of a fun thing to do too, is take something that is naturally really small and you don't have to make it gigantic. Like if you made spiders that were just, a yard across, that's already ridiculous. And that's going to really freak out a lot of people, but that's the thing is like you don't have to make it the size of a building. You don't have to make these things nuts. You can just exaggerate pieces of them a little bit, and all of a sudden it becomes tremendously more interesting. So I definitely have more examples of making things big here than I have examples of making things small. But both are certainly doable. Though I do have one example of making something small that is kind of fun. And that's this sheep right here where it's not super small, but the idea of they're just trying to shrink it through breeding to make the legs much, much, much shorter so that probably they can't run away as fast, but you might have to go visit that episode for that. So the next thing that you can change is you can change a creature's environment. And that's something that you can see really easily right here. By taking these animals that obviously generally dwell in the water and having them dwell in the air instead, you get something that's far more unique. And this is another really easy place to start. That's obviously what's happened with this pika here, who's gone from kind of highlands tundra down to like Arctic tundra. And then the hippo, which obviously, live in Africa, coming up to a cold environment. These birds are probably things that would have lived here anyway, so that's not really, transitioning crazy in that fashion. But changing the environment of a creature can do a lot for you. And the nice part is this is a good strategy if you haven't really thought about it too much, or you feel like you're kind of at a dead end as far as ideas go. That's because the second you shift the environment of an animal, you've got all these new things you have to understand. If you take something like a camel and it exists in a moist environment, there's a lot of questions that have to be answered now, because camels are devised specifically for dry environments. You might find pretty quickly in that investigation that it's not a particularly good creature for that environment. And sometimes that means you change it, basically implying thousands of years or tens of thousands of years of evolution, or you can let it die out and shift it into something totally different. In that particular scenario, the idea of the camel, which is an arid environment specialist, moving to somewhere that's much more moist is probably not going to be a really good idea. But you could move it to somewhere else that has totally different arid environments. I really enjoy in this endeavor, though, two specific things. I like taking things that are generally in the ocean and moving them onto land, and I like taking things that live in, normal terrestrial environments and moving them into water. You saw the same kind of thing earlier with those jellyfish that are now floating, or cephalopods that are now floating. Those kind of environment changes are dramatic. And I feel like that's one of the most fun things you can do with fantasy world building specifically, is you can create these things that just don't make sense in our world, but then you can bend the laws of physics just enough or through magic and get these really fantastic, interesting things. One of the lovely parts about fantasy is fantasy, I think, probably by its nature, should feel somewhat familiar. Whereas science fiction is really in that realm of exploring the impossible, things that can't happen or would be incredibly, incredibly unlikely to happen. And so you get, alien species that we have to hypothesize about how they would even function. But in fantasy, it's kind of nice to have things that are familiar. To have snails or crabs the size of homes would obviously be a huge shift on our world, but we understand what a snail is, that a snail is fat, or that a snail is slow and not fast. So you can kind of play with those kind of things. It makes it easier for the people who are enjoying the world you're putting together to have some baseline knowledge about how things function. And that allows you to get away with a lot more, I think. You can do some really bizarre and interesting things because you don't have to handle everything, because some of those pieces of knowledge are already known by your audience, by anyone you might share your work with. So we know, how octopi function. We know how squid function. We know what nautiloids are. And all these kinds of things mean that if you devise a creature that is an extension of that, just in a new environment or shifted in some way, you don't have to explain everything. And that allows you to get away with a lot. So I find that changing the environment is honestly one of the most fun ones, particularly because it just means a lot of problem solving, and I really enjoy that. What if you had frogs that lived in super hot, arid environments? Well, we do on Earth. So what if you take some of those that do and you just exaggerate those features? Most crabs and mollusks, obviously, and crustaceans, obviously live really close to moist environments, but not all of them do. Roly-polies and pillbugs, those are crustaceans. As far as I know, the only one that we have at a place like Colorado. So playing with that idea of how could you have crabs and lobsters and things like that lived entirely terrestrially, that lived in the mountains. Obviously hermit crabs don't need to have, they need to have moisture, but they don't breathe underwater, I don't believe. And so that, can be extended. And what if you had giant hermit crabs that lived up in the mountains? Is that possible? I don't know. It doesn't seem like you'd have to do a lot of research to figure it out. And all of a sudden you can have something that feels familiar and at the same time is totally unique and totally interesting. I enjoy doing this with reptiles as well, and most of us really enjoy dinosaurs. And though they don't live in our time, obviously, they can be taken and implemented in these kinds of ways. Moved into environments and at sizes and things that kind of fit in new and interesting manners. The third of these is to change a core feature. And when I'm talking about core features, I'm not meaning physical features. That's actually the next one on this list. Core features might be something akin to some of the stuff we've talked about already. So it might be, this is an aquatic animal and I'm changing that. Obviously that's environment specific, but what if you take an animal that generally doesn't exist in herds and you put it into herds, or vice versa? Imagine if these birds here are actually very solitary rather than so many bird species in our world that are, flocking animals. What if you upped the size tremendously? What if this guy is, more like to a pterodon, and so you have something where it's 8 to 10 feet tall? So we've exaggerated the size, and it doesn't do a lot of flying now because it's so heavy. It does mostly gliding, maybe, to move from one location to another, or rides out storms or something. And so we've changed the size, we've kind of changed the environment a little bit, and now we're changing a core feature. It's no longer an animal that does anything with others of its kind. It's very, very solitary. Changing a core feature of how an animal functions is a really interesting thing. What if you had animals that don't normally hibernate, and in your story they hibernate? Or what if you have animals that, hibernate in really, really unique ways? I was talking with a friend yesterday about the idea of what if you had an animal like a frog or a toad, where they're mostly mouth and stomach, and this critter would distend its body to such an extraordinary degree, swallowing food that is much bigger than itself, and then it just hibernates on the spot. They're just big enough or too difficult to eat, or maybe they're venomous or poisonous, and so they literally will just eat a thing and then just hibernate there. They don't care because they know that nothing's going to predate them. That's changing a core feature in a dynamic way, but it would really make it interesting, and you'd have some new things to play with. in how that creature functions. What if you take something that doesn't generally have fur or feathers and you give it that? Obviously, that's going to be a physical feature, but it's going to change some things about where that animal can live and what it can do. Though I suppose I'll get to that one in our next little category here. What other manners of core features could you change on an animal? You could easily change portions of the life cycle. Right now I'm working on a moth, and these were hermit crabs, and I was just talking about a toad. All of these animals have pretty distinct life cycles. So what if you had a moth that didn't go through the caterpillar stage? What would that even look like? Could it pupate while it was moving? Could it almost like grow its own new body and then transfer its consciousness, so still stay like alive at the same time? I don't know, but it could be really intriguing. What if your amphibians didn't have the standard manner of going through the egg, tadpole, kind of nymph-ish stage, and then moving on into their adult? What if they did it all gradually and they did all of it on land or all of it in water? What if the egg stage was a longer stage for some species than it is on our world? I don't know. There's a lot to consider here. This is probably one of the more difficult ones. When I was thinking about it earlier, as I was put together my 4 bullet points, right? I was considering herding animals and breaking that apart. Animals that group, animals that don't group. But really, as you're exploring any animal, you're going to come up with some core traits. Beavers build dams. Ants and termites build these large cities. And both of those features could be changed. They could be either dismantled from that animal, or what I think is probably far more interesting is they could be added to another. So what if you had moths that built gigantic cities? What if you had crabs that lived communally and built cities and things like that? What if you had elephants that built dams? There's a lot of different ways you could go with this, and all you've got to do is just modify and look at things that exist in our world or other things that you've already created in your own world. And that's another thing that doesn't really fit neatly into this episode, but is something that is going to play a really dynamic role if you start doing this on any kind of scale. And that's the fact that all of the species in your world are going to inform one another. Because that's how it works in our world. Everything exists in some semblance of balance. There is a predator for every prey. There is an escape mechanism. There is a manner in dealing with the environment that they find themselves. All of these things are true. And so as you create your fantasy animals and creatures, whether you're riffing off of existing things or otherwise, you are going to find that they have to have a niche in that environment. Sometimes when you change the size of a thing, you change what's able to predate on it. And you can do some really intriguing things that way. Every animal is going to have its place in your ecosystem unless it was introduced or it's magical or there's some other force at play. But in general, they're all going to fit in there. One of the things that I haven't spent a ton of time thinking about is if I supersize a whole bunch of animals, that's really going to change some environmental aspects. And I'm also building my world kind of off the idea that most of the animals that we have in our world exist there, but they're just way more diverse. It's like normal horses exist in Nethervoid. Normal moths and butterflies exist in Nethervoid. Normal birds exist there. But there's also these kind of crazy extensions of things. And I don't know how big a lore person you are, obviously, but you might run into the issue of, well, if this isn't Earth, why do I have all these Earth animals? Sometimes in fantasy, it's nice to build everything from scratch. Though I would argue that's far more of a science fiction kind of thing. There's no reason why you can't do it in fantasy. For me, I also thought about this issue, and I decided rather than let it bother me, the idea is that the mythology of my world is Earth exists in my world building. It's just not the world that we're on right now, but that the creators, the gods, the one true god and then his assistants essentially, they had some styles that they enjoyed in animal creation. Things that were done on Uluru, which is the world that I'm working on, and they have basically copy pasted those. So if I ever do any planes hopping, it'll be like, oh, like there's horses here too. Oh, this is a whole planet of reptiles, because the gods who created everything liked certain designs and took them and put them on other places. And that means that there's going to be planets that are entirely comprised of some of these features, which is I don't know if I'll get into that, anytime soon, but it will be fun eventually to get into this idea of like, there is a planet that is nothing but insects. There is a planet that is nothing but rodents. And what does that look like? Do we have sentient rodents? Like, that would be really cool and really intriguing, just to have like, that's the way that the evolution/creation worked here. Those kind of things are exciting to me. They're not essential for your world building, but they're something that I really like to think about. I like to make sure that there's some semblance of logic to all the things that I'm developing, even if the logic is just mostly internal. The last of our 4 things here is to exaggerate a physical feature. This is perhaps the most exciting and the most intriguing. The easiest way to do this is just to take one physical aspect of your thing and either change it dramatically, shift its size, shift its purpose, whatever that might be. So let's explore what this might look like. This might be changing out the claw on a crab for a totally different shape. Maybe it's a shovel so that it can dig. This might be changing the antlers on a creature to be of a totally different shape. But there are a lot of way more fun ways that you can do this. So if you look at some of these that I created prior, like what is the physical feature I'm changing primarily on these? It's size. But some of the whales have, spikes. Some of the ones I haven't drawn here are going to have giant, narwhal tusks and things coming out. Some are going to have additional fins. This guy's got horns coming off. A lot of these are much more environment changing. Some of the features that I changed on these guys, though, is like I made just their necks longer or their legs longer, or added these antlers or horns that do tremendously different things. Added in, features that are going to change like how that creature functions, essentially. I started doing that a little bit with these crabs here as well. Playing with like, what if you modify tremendous components of them? So obviously there's going to be some more that I'm going to need to play with in time. But this is one of the most enjoyable aspects that can be modified in an animal, is just take something that is a core physical feature of that creature and then augment it in tremendous ways. What if your dogs had 2 tails? Is there any reason why they can't? No. I mean, based on like how vertebrates work right now, you'd have a tough time there, but you don't have to solve all those issues. I like to. I have not decided, or I've decided not to include creatures that couldn't theoretically exist based on bone structure and whatnot in our world. But there is no reason why you don't need to, or why you need to follow those rules. Sorry, sometimes when I'm drawing, it gets hard to speak at the same time. So, can you have mammals in your world that have additional limbs? Absolutely. Can you have animals that have gigantic heads or way smaller heads than normal, or have features that would just not make sense? There's no reason why you couldn't have people that had antlers, right? Like, that's a mammalian feature. So perhaps your mammalian humans could actually have those in some way. There's nothing wrong with that. There's no reason why these guys can't have spikes and can't have, like, why can't I just do like some spikes coming out of this guy? Just like you would see from more, dinosaur-oriented animals. There's no reason why I couldn't give these crabs some kind of claw that actually is like an injector that shoots some kind of thing like, a pistol shrimp does. But maybe they have something that can work to that effect on land. I don't know. There's no reason why you can't massively modify or exaggerate features. And sometimes this is like actually changing and putting a new thing on. Sometimes it is just remarkably exaggerating a feature. If you've got your, let's see how I can do this. So let's say we've got something like a sheep here, right? Or like a goat of some kind. And generally speaking, it would have the antlers or horns. Like, what if you took those and just made them absolutely absurd? So they kind of come up here, and like, what if they went all the way to the ground? and drug on the ground. And that's like the only reason why these animals are able to move, is because they actually rest their antlers or their horns on the ground. Like, that seems ridiculous and totally impractical, but could you exaggerate that feature in such a way that it made some sense, that it was interesting, or at least made your story, just a little bit different than any other story? If you were going to do something like that, then you might have, to make these creatures far, far more muscular than they would generally be in our world, because they're moving stuff that is tremendously heavy. Exaggerating a singular physical feature like that is probably the most enjoyable way, because you're essentially going like, what happens if we put wings on it? What happens if we put spikes on it? What happens if we put extra arms on it? Those kind of things are fun. And sometimes that's going to turn out really dumb, and you're going to look at things that you designed and go, wow, that was a really poor decision. But it's just world building. Like, it's just drawing. Like, who cares if you make a mistake? Have fun with things. Try new stuff. Try stuff that's probably going to fail. Every once in a while, those things that you expect to go south, things that you didn't expect to work, will actually work in tremendous ways. And there's a lot of excitement in that. There's a lot of fulfillment in having things that you didn't expect to turn out well actually turn out well and function. And you just can't know until you get into it. So those are kind of my benchmarks here. I will revisit these in a future video, and I will, from this and your comments and explorations and whatnot, I think I will design something that almost is like a sheet. Like, here's some stuff that you can exaggerate to create some really varied, different manners of doing this. But again, those modifications are, number 1, change size. Number 2, change environment. Number 3, change a core feature, such as herding instincts or how they function if they hibernate, if they migrate. And 4, exaggerate a physical feature. I think if you just use these strategies, that you can create some really, really unique animals, some really funky stuff. And this, again, is just under the category of creating and riffing off of what exists in our world. And there's no reason why you have to do that. I do think it is a good place to start if you're just starting world building, because that link to reality makes it easier to get your footing. But once you've gotten your footing, once you kind of have an idea of what you want to do, go wild, have fun, just do crazy things, because the worst that can happen is that a drawing just doesn't turn out that well. And in the grand scheme of things, that's just not that big a deal. So I'm going to keep going here. I'm going to keep developing all these crazy guys. Got a lot done, actually, during this session. I'm going to finish them off, probably race out and get some coloring done at some point. I'm excited to see where the rest of this book goes. This exploration has been really enjoyable. I've got some other creatures here that I need to work on. This is a crag rhino, which is just a massive creature that actually has plants and things that start to grow on it. And, again, just modeled off of our creatures. I've got some dwellings and stuff here I need to work on. I even actually started drawing out some of the races, though I'm not particularly happy with how they're coming along. I will get a little bit more into them here soon. And I've got their dwellings to explore too, the sprites here. Just bumped the mic, sorry. That'll be really fun to explore. And I almost thought about for this section talking about gods and deities, but we'll have to wait to get to those guys. Well, as always, thanks for being here. I really appreciate the time. I love hearing your feedback and your comments, especially based on what you're designing. As this episode was working on critters, I'd love to hear what kind of animals and creatures you have in your environment that are built off of things in our world that you've greatly exaggerated or that you've played with, or they just maybe incorporate in a new and different way. Thank you to my patrons who are on the screen right now. If you want to check out the Patreon or the Discord server, they are both linked below. We would love to have you check out those communities. Well, have a good one, y'all. See you soon.